Hello everyone, my name is Taylor from Market Car, and today I'm bringing you a full guide on the reliability of the BMW E70 X5 so that you know which model to get. Just for some background, this right here is my dad's 2010 BMW X5 30D. He's had this car for like 13 years now, and he's done over 200,000 kilometers on it, 210, which is around 130,000 miles. And of course, it has served him very well during that time. So this is a really good car to get. But before you get one, you need to know what the main problems are, what you can expect as an ownership experience, and which model you should get. And before we start, I just want to give a huge shout out to the Miles Driven YouTube channel, Almost Car Reviews on their website, and Zach from BMW Tuning for providing a lot of information in this guide. First, let's go over some of the general problems that all of the models of the E70 generation have, and a lot of them are right here in this back area of the car. Something that's really common on these cars is that the rear tailgate struts can fail, especially if you have an electronically opening trunk, which can be quite annoying because then you have to open your trunk manually. Another common issue with these cars is that some of them came with rear air suspension, and the airbags in the rear air suspension tend to fail, so you can expect to pay quite a lot of money to replace those. And another common failure point are the rear taillights. The seals on these inner parts of the taillights tend to break and then slowly leak moisture into them over time, which means that on a lot of these cars, the inner part of the taillight doesn't actually work. This isn't that big of a deal because you can just disable them completely like we did here, and even a replacement is not that big of a deal. Now, some of the mechanical problems that this generation of the car can have are the coolant hoses underneath the hood, and these hoses over time get brittle, they can break. Now, if one of your coolant hoses breaks, it's going to cause a coolant leak and it's probably going to leave you stranded. The best way to prevent that, of course, is to check all the coolant hoses periodically and make sure that none of them are failing, and then replacing the ones that look like they're about to fail. Another common failure point on these cars is the high pressure fuel pump. So if you're buying one of these and you see that it's been replaced recently, it's a good sign. And the last thing in these general problems that I want to cover is the transmission fluid. The automatic transmissions in these cars have fluid inside them that's rated for the life of the transmission. However, if you actually want your transmission to last for a long time, it's recommended to replace this fluid at around 60,000 kilometers or every 37,000 miles. Now, before we go into the reliability aspect of every engine, I do want to say that these cars in general, no matter which engine you get, are going to be pretty reliable. If you spend a bit of time on forums or maybe even in my comment section, you can see testimonials from owners of BMW X5s from this generation saying that their X5, no matter what the engine is, never left them stranded in 200,000 miles. All they did was change the oil. They had zero problems. And if you get a low mileage one, a really nice one that's been taken care of and done all the service, then this is pretty much the ownership experience that you can expect. Any sort of unreliability or issues in these cars is going to be an exception more than the rule. Now let's get to the engine choices in this car and the specific problems that the engines might have and their general reliability. First, let's go over the diesel engines in this car, and the first generations of the X5, the pre-facelift, came with this inline-six M57 engine. This engine was included in the 30D, the 30SD, and in the 35D. Even though this M57 is known to be reliable, there still are some issues that you should keep in mind and know about. Something that's really common on this engine is the timing chain replacement, which is pretty much inevitable. At some point, you're going to have to replace it. Another common failure point is the turbo. The turbo might need to be replaced as well if it's on its way out. And you can't forget about the swirl flaps in this engine, which a lot of people just choose to delete completely and preventatively take care of that problem before it gets to be an actual issue. The last two things I want to mention in this specific engine are the EGR valve and the DPF. As with all diesel engines, the EGR valve can get clogged and might need some cleaning to get rid of that carbon buildup, and the DPF filter might need replacing or cleaning or maybe even deleting. Now, in the facelift model of the E70, the M57 engine was actually replaced by the N57 engine. This is the engine that came in the 30D, the 40D, and the M50D models. That engine basically suffers from the same issues that the M57 suffers from, which are the timing chain issues, as well as the EGR valve and the DPF. Now, what makes the N57 engine a bit less desirable to own is that the timing chain is actually located in the back of the engine, which means that the engine needs to come out for the timing chain replacement. That just means that the service on those models is going to be a bit more expensive. And another thing to keep in mind is that the 40D and the M50D came with 2 and 3 turbos respectively, which means that your trouble with the turbos essentially doubled or tripled depending on the model of the N57 that you got. Another thing to keep in mind is that these cars cost a lot when they were brand brand new, which means that the service performed on them is going to cost a lot too. And while the prices of the cars may have dropped down, the prices of the service remains the same. The first of the petrol models is the N52 engine, which came in the 30i and the 30si. The main issues that this engine suffers from are the engine ticking, the oil leaks, and the coolant leaks. Now, the N52 engine ticks can be caused by a multitude of things like bad ignition coils or bad spark plugs, but the worst possibility is that it could be a sign of Vanos failure. The oil leaks mainly come from the oil housing or the valve cover gasket, and the coolant leaks, of course, come from those broken hoses that we covered earlier. And the updated version of that engine, the N55, which came in the 35i, suffers from basically the exact same issues: ticking, oil leaks, and coolant leaks. Now we move on to the V8s in this car, and the first of which is the N62 engine, which came in the 48i models. That engine was actually carried over from the previous generation of the X5, the E53, which means that it stood the test of time and it's pretty reliable as V8s go. Although it does have its own problems like the valve stem seams, which do cause issues on these cars. And of course, you can expect the usual like the oil leaks and the coolant leaks that we covered earlier. The best thing to do to keep these engines reliable is to just change the oil regularly. The recommended interval is around 8,000 kilometers or 5,000 miles. So if you're buying one of these and you see that the owner has been changing the oil religiously and he hasn't skipped a single oil change, then it's a good sign that the engine will keep performing well if it's already performing well. And now we move on to the N63 engine, which came in the 50i. This engine was relatively less reliable than the N62 that we just covered, and that's because it has a lot of failure points like the fuel injector failure, the timing chain failure, and the double Vanos failure. It also has the same valve stem seal issue that the N62 has, and it's also been reported that it consumes a lot of oil. Now on the flip side, the S63 engine, which came in the X5M, is actually a lot more reliable. Of course, because it's an M engine, it's going to require more maintenance, and that maintenance is going to be a bit more expensive because of the M parts. However, the S63 doesn't really have any common failure points. Yes, it still does eat a lot of oil, and yes, you have to change the oil pretty frequently, but other than that, it's actually one of the more reliable engines in this car. The only thing to keep in mind is that if you're buying one that hasn't been maintained properly, then you don't really know what the condition of the engine is in, and then you get those horror stories of people buying these cars and then the engine exploding on them. Okay, so what did we learn? The best diesel engine for this car is the M57 engine. It's the most reliable, and it's going to give you the least headaches in your ownership. However, if you do want a petrol engine and you don't want the 3-liter inline 6 and you want to go for a V8, then my recommendation is to go all out and get the X5M with the S63 engine. And it's going to be something that you can enjoy driving every single day. Now, just as a side note, whichever engine you choose to go for, make sure that it's running well when you're buying it. The best idea would be to get a mechanic to inspect the car and to make sure that everything's in perfect order before you buy it. Even an X5 with the least reliable engine but with low miles and a good maintenance history is going to be more reliable than a high mile one which hasn't been taken care of. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.